Okay, can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, first of all, my name is Eunice Kim, and I'm a LCSW, a lecturer at California State University in Los Angeles. I'm also working on PhD at Loma University, and I'll be presenting this paper about disproportionate intimate partner violence endorsement among Afghan women. And there are two other faculties from Loma Linda University helping me with this paper, as well as one subject matter expert. I need to say that I am recovering from cold. I have frog in my voice, and this is not my normal voice. And I apologize in advance for any inconvenience my voice might cause. Okay, for background information, intimate partner violence, IPV, is a well-documented global concern persisting with far-reaching health and behavioral health and economic consequences, despite over 3 decades of global movement and over 5 decades of the battered women movement in the US to reduce IPV. And notably, in Afghanistan, there were nationwide efforts to address gender inequalities with and without international aid for over 30 years since 1960s. And still, Afghanistan is designated as the most dangerous country in the world for women, according to the 2011 Thomson Reuters poll, and also ranked almost at the bottom for gender inequality, according to the 2015 United Nations Development Program, and as well as according to the 2019 Georgetown Institute Women, Peace and Security Index. And IPV, particularly physical abuse, remains extensive in Afghanistan, highest among 46 low-income and middle-income countries. And more worrisome is Afghan women ranked highest in IPV endorsement among 39 low and middle income countries. And this is our subject matter that we are examining. And our research questions center around to what extent do Afghan women endorse IPV in different circumstances? What sociodemographic and contextual factors explain the disproportionate IPV endorsement among Afghan women? And in answering these questions, what we wanted to identify was the social and cultural determinants of their IPV endorsement. And we also wanted to identify culture and context specific variations. And according to existing data on risk factors, the most commonly documented risk factors are accepting attitude, younger age, and the typical low socioeconomic factors and limited resources. Some broad IPV literature address also the cross-generational transmission of IPV endorsement, and limited data also addresses a fear factor of a spouse and partner, but the broad IPV literature is addressing the fear factor in the context of marital conflict. Some emerging studies for developing countries with restricted women's rights are also addressing early marriage, religion, ethnicity, and the number of living children. I found one a study stating that greater number of children represent traditional lifestyle, and with women with more children tends to endorse IPV. Now, there are some Afghan studies addressing broad gender inequality and the prevalence of IPV, however, not addressing the IPV endorsement, the sources of IPV endorsement among this group of women. And I want to highlight, I want to point out that the popular IPV approach is women's empowerment, or changing attitude to IPV by increasing traditional education, jobs, wealth, media exposure, and decision-making. However, what we are arguing with our study is that this approach is not working for Afghan women. For this group of women, it is very important to consider their social and cultural context. And African women endure severe gender constraints dictated by multidimensional societal forces, which include solid patriarchal tradition, conservative religion, protracted political conflict, and nationwide poverty. And these women are confined to the home and domestic affairs. Their mobility is under the close scrutiny of men and in-laws. Their deviations from traditional gender norms are punished systematically. IPV is a culturally and religiously sanctioned practice in this country. Afghan women have no functioning social and legal protection against IPV, and nationwide political conflict and poverty worsen family functioning, thereby intensifying IPV. Now, given Afghan women's social cultural context, we hypothesize that the disproportionate IPV endorsement is socially and culturally determined, and we adopted intersectionality and social entrapment frameworks. And based on these two theoretical frameworks, we accounted for additional societal factors we could identify beyond the commonly documented risk factors to verify the social and cultural determinants. And also we wanted to identify culture and context specific variations. Now, our study is a cross-sectional study. Excuse me. We extracted our data from the most recent 2015 Afghan demographic and health surveys, and this DHS is a popular transnational research instrument that collects demographic and health data from many countries. And we made sure that the Afghan DHS data fulfill the standards for ethical research, including privacy and gender matching etiquette. Now, IPV endorsement is our outcome variable, and a series of possible circumstances for IPV endorsement include wife going without telling husband, neglecting the children, arguing with husband, refusing sex, and burning the food. And for primary sociodemographic risk factors, we use age and typical socioeconomic factors and media exposure variables. And because of limited societal factors available, we use fear of husbands, province level conflict severity, prior exposure to parental IPV, early marriage, ethnicity, number of living children, and decision-making power variables as a broader social and cultural indicators. And we use SPSS version 28 to do our analysis. We use multivariate hierarchical logistic analysis. Here are the results for sample. We use over 20,000 married women aged 15 to 49 from Afghanistan's 34 provinces. And these women belong to 9 ethnic groups, with Pashtun and Tajik being the most prominent. And most women resided in rural areas with no education, no work history, and illiterate, and substantial number of women were economically poor, with 20.4% of women being the most destitute. Now, in our study, 80.7% endorse IPV in at least one of the 5 hypothetical circumstances presented to them, leaving 19.3% rejecting IPV under all circumstances. And the most endorsed circumstance was leaving home without telling their husbands, followed by arguing with their husbands and neglecting their children. And at the bivariate level, all predictors we identified except province level IPV acceptance considered as a cultural norm were significant. The non-significance of the cultural norm was a surprise finding because my supervising investigator on this study also completed another study for prevalence of IPV. In that study, this cultural norm was significant. However, for IPV endorsement, this cultural norm was non-significant. Now, at the bivariate level, the fear of husband was the most significant factor, and the gap between the fear factor and the rest was noteworthy. It was very substantial, which is consistent with the multivariate level, which I'll here is a table I try to fit in, and it's just too big and you cannot see it. Let me move on to multivariate analysis. In our initial model, the primary sociodemographic predictors explain about 4.1% variance in the outcome variable, with the respondents' past employment being the most significant factor, and which had the positive relationship with the outcome variable. In our second model, including the broader social and cultural indicators, 13.1% of variance in the outcome variable was explained by this model, with the fear factor being the most significant. And similar to the bivariate level analysis, the effect size of this fear factor was twofold or greater than the other variables. In our restricted model, examining the partial contribution of each social and cultural indicator, the fear factor alone accounted for 9.4% of the outcome variable controlling the primary sociodemographic factors. And the province level conflict accounted another 1.6%, and prior exposure to parental violence explain only 0.8% variance, and the rest of indicators range from 0.1 to 0.5%, not that substantial. Here is a table, and again, too big for the PowerPoint pager, so you cannot see, but the narrative, I presented the narrative in the prior page. Now, we found the extensive culture and context-specific variations. For instance, some other similar studies for other developing countries, neglecting children was the most endorsed circumstance. However, leaving home without telling their husband was the most IPV endorsed circumstance. And we are looking at this more as a culture-specific variation as it aligns with their cultural context. And again, the province level IPV acceptance being non-significant, we are looking at this more context-specific variation. And due to some time limitation, I'll skip the rest of the variations. But I want to address one more variation here. As expected, the women with healthcare and purchase decision-making power decrease the likelihood of IPV endorsement. However, the woman with family visit decision-making power actually increased IPV endorsement, and this was a surprise finding for us. For discussion, I'll just point out a few things. One, the aggregate effects of the broader social and cultural indicators explain an over threefold variance in the IPV endorsement, which supports the core principle of intersectionality theory. And we conclude that the additional societal stressors Afghan women endure explain the disproportionate IPV endorsement. We also conclude that the IPV endorsement among this group of women is socially and culturally determined, which is also reinforced by the fear factor. And given Afghan women's social cultural context, the fear factor conceivably represents their fear of a more profound alienation by a male privileged custom in this society. And then the protracted political conflict, which was also significant, compounds this fear, and together supports this social entrapment idea that accounts for an external enactment of IPV endorsement as opposed to autonomous decision making. And of course, the extension list of variations strengthens the intersectionality perspective on multiplicity and individuality in IPV correlates and many possible outcomes. And this result, however, requires further investigation. Just quickly, the implication is that Afghan women's IPV endorsement is a social and cultural construct, and the variations prompt a nuanced approach to addressing diverse conditions sustaining the IPV endorsement. Prior women's empowering initiative is not working, and we recommend, as a first step, we recommend a community-based campaign to increase awareness of the multi-level IPV consequences in collaboration with the governing bodies in the society or the Afghan diaspora. And I'll skip the limitation and conclusion. I'll just wrap up by saying that research must continue to further uncover the latent sources of this important topic. And the study findings may inspire the IPV field in general to consider or diversify IPV approaches. Thank you for listening.